He boarded quietly with a first-class ticket and a name they didn't bother to learn. But by the time this plane landed, he'd silently rewritten the rules of the entire airline. So what exactly happened in seat 7C, and why are people across the country still talking about it? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The early morning light peeked through the slats of the blinds in Jalen Thorne's apartment in Harlem. Outside, the hum of the city was starting to rise. Distant car horns, someone dragging a rolling trash bin across uneven pavement, and a radio playing old soul music from a neighbor's window. Jalen stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the knot of his charcoal gray tie. His movements were slow but practiced, like muscle memory etched from years of showing up prepared, even when people didn't expect him to. He glanced over at his suitcase near the door, already packed, neatly zipped. A leather briefcase leaned beside it, carrying documents for a major meeting that had taken him months to arrange. Today, he was flying to Seattle to finalize a partnership that could shift millions of dollars into minority-owned businesses through his nonprofit investment firm, Thorne Equity Alliance. Jalen had walked a long road to get here. Years of being overlooked in rooms he built, doubted in industries he understood better than most. He didn't carry bitterness, but he carried memory. And that memory made him precise, intentional. His suit was custom-tailored, but not flashy. His shoes shined, but didn't squeak. The only jewelry he wore was a slim black watch, a gift from his father, who used to say, "Respect starts with how you show up, especially when the world expects you not to." As he poured himself a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant, Carla. All set for Seattle. File uploaded. Confirmed seat 1C, first class. You're cleared for Sky Lounge access too. He nodded slightly to himself. Not in pride, just focus. The kind that keeps you grounded when you've learned that success doesn't always buy acceptance. Some things still needed to be earned again and again, like trust, like space, like belonging. An hour later, Jalen was sliding into the back of a black sedan en route to JFK. The driver, a chatty older man with a thick Brooklyn accent, talked about his niece starting nursing school. Jalen smiled, listening more than speaking, hands loosely resting on the handle of his briefcase. The airport was bustling when he arrived. Travelers tugging luggage, parents corralling kids, business people marching toward their gates with purpose. Inside Terminal 8, the cool, polished interior of the Skyridge Air check-in area offered a sharp contrast to the movement outside. It was quiet, almost serene. Jalen walked up to the priority lane, passport and ticket in hand. The agent, a young man with sharp features, took his documents without looking up right away. When he finally glanced at Jalen, there was the faintest flicker of surprise. Just a blink. But Jalen saw it. He always did. It was the kind of look that said, "You sure you're in the right line?" Even when no words were spoken. Still, the man processed the check-in, handed back his documents, and gestured toward the lounge with a stiff nod. Jalen moved through security, accustomed to the dance. Laptop out, shoes off, belt in the tray. No problems today, though one guard did scan his ID twice as if waiting for something to pop up. It didn't. He walked toward the Sky Lounge, scanning his boarding pass at the glass entrance. The automatic doors opened with a gentle whoosh. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled faintly of citrus and leather. Soft jazz played overhead. A few business travelers sat with their laptops open, coffee in hand. A couple in suits whispered about earnings reports. Jalen found a seat near the window and opened his phone. The contract was there, clean, ready. All it needed was a final signature after the meeting in Seattle. His eyes drifted to the tarmac outside. Planes slowly moved between gates, their tails marked with Skyridge's silver and blue crest. He leaned back, letting the silence settle. This wasn't new to him. Flying first class, navigating boardrooms, being the only black man in meetings that talked about inclusion without ever quite including him. But today felt heavier. Not ominous, just charged. Maybe it was the weight of the deal, or maybe it was something else he couldn't name. Somewhere in the lounge, a barista called out an order for a cappuccino. A nearby businessman chuckled over something on his phone. Jalen's eyes shifted toward the boarding screen. Skyridge 616, New York to Seattle. On time. Boarding at gate C12. He glanced at his watch, took a breath, and stood. As he made his way toward the gate, rolling his suitcase behind him, he passed a woman in a sharp navy blazer with a Sky Ridge pin on her lapel. She looked up from her tablet just long enough to meet his eyes, then looked away again without a word. And in that blink of silence, just like the look at the check-in counter, Jalen felt it. Not hostility, just something colder, a quiet calculation. As he walked toward gate C12, something in the air felt off. Not loud, not obvious, but real. And deep down, a part of him knew. The seat might be first class, but the welcome? That remained to be seen. Gate C12 was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from something held just under the surface. Tension, maybe, or expectation. Jalen stepped up to the priority boarding lane, briefcase in hand. There was no line, just a few passengers standing nearby, waiting for the boarding call. A female flight attendant stood behind the gate podium, her name tag catching the light. Madison Greer. She had a perfectly pressed uniform, her blonde hair pulled back into a low twist, and an expression that seemed calm until her eyes met his. Her gaze flicked down to his briefcase, then back to his face. There was no smile, no welcome, just a pause, half a second longer than necessary. Then she took his boarding pass. First class, she murmured, like reading an answer she wasn't quite expecting. Jalen kept his posture relaxed, nodded politely. Yes, 1C, she scanned the pass. The beep confirmed it. Valid, no issues. Still, Madison didn't move. She tilted her head slightly and looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone else to walk up behind him. Then, almost under her breath, but just loud enough, she said, First class is really opening up these days, huh? He wasn't sure if he was meant to hear it, but he had. And by the way, the younger male attendant beside her smirked without making eye contact. He had too. Jalen said nothing. He stepped aside as Madison gestured him forward. Not inviting, just permitting, like she was doing him a favor. As he walked down the jet bridge, he focused on his breath, steady and even. These things didn't shock him anymore, but that didn't make them weightless. They stayed, like echoes. The aircraft interior was softly lit, bathed in golden hues, meant to mimic a late afternoon glow. First class had a quiet elegance, wide leather seats, polished wood accents, and a calm, curated playlist barely audible under the hum of the ventilation. He found seat 1C window seat, directly across from the galley. He opened the overhead bin, empty, still cool from the aircraft's air. He reached up to place his briefcase inside. "Excuse me, sir," came Madison's voice, cutting through the soft music like a blade. She had appeared behind him without a sound. "You'll need to keep that with you. Overhead bins are already secured." Jalen turned to look at her, calm, confused. "The flight hasn't finished boarding. Policy requires bins to be closed 10 minutes before final cabin prep," she replied. Her voice was steady, polished, but there was a stiffness beneath it, like something calculated. He glanced back up. The bin was empty, open, waiting. "I was just about to—" "It's closed now," she said. Then, without another word, she reached over him and shut the bin with a firm snap. The sound echoed sharp against the hushed atmosphere. Jalen stood there for a moment, hands still near the latch, before letting it fall. He adjusted his grip on the briefcase and took his seat, the bag awkwardly propped on his lap. It wasn't large, but it wasn't small either. Just bulky enough to be a problem for a cross-country flight. Inside were his laptop, documents, and the contract that needed signing later. The contents were too important to risk at his feet, crammed under a seat, crushed by stray knees or spilled drinks. But still, he said nothing. Madison walked off without another word, heels clicking softly on the carpet. Her posture was flawless. Across the aisle, a middle-aged white man in linen slacks and boat shoes stumbled into the cabin. He pulled a large roller bag behind him, bumping it once against the seat armrest. "Oh, whoops," he laughed. "A bit late to the party." Madison turned back immediately. Her face lit up, real smile this time. "No problem at all, Mr. Kearns," she said sweetly, reaching to help him. "Let me get that for you." She opened the overhead bin 2 rows back, one that was definitely still empty, and lifted the bag in with ease. No mention of policy, no closing time warning, just help. Jalen watched the entire interaction unfold like a movie he'd seen too many times. Predictable in its rhythm, exhausting in its repetition. Still, he said nothing. He shifted in his seat, adjusting the weight of the briefcase on his thighs. The leather pressed into his legs uncomfortably. A faint ache began building in his lower back. Passengers continued boarding. A woman with a Louis Vuitton carry-on. A man in a tailored tan suit whispering into a Bluetooth headset. Soft murmurs, casual laughter, champagne being poured at the front. The disparity wasn't surprising, but it didn't feel any less sharp. His phone buzzed. Carla again. All numbers confirmed for 3 p.m. meeting Pacific Standard Time. Final docs in your inbox. He typed a short reply with one hand while the other rested protectively on his briefcase. Received. Will sign and send before landing. When he looked up again, a woman across the aisle in a cream shawl was staring at him. Just for a moment too long. She didn't smile. Didn't look away with embarrassment. Just blinked slowly and turned her head without acknowledgement. Madison reappeared, gliding through the cabin. She offered towels to the man in 1D, asked the woman in 2A if she preferred sparkling or still water. She didn't look at Jalen. She didn't stop. There was something about being ignored in a space meant to serve you that stung more than being insulted. One is loud, the other is surgical. As the final boarding call played and the cabin doors closed, Jalen leaned back, shifting to ease the strain in his back. The weight of the briefcase made it impossible to sit fully upright. He was still adjusting when Madison appeared again, clipboard in hand. Her expression was neutral. Too neutral. "Mr. Thorne," she said, voice clear enough to carry to the seats around them. "We've detected a malfunction in the recline function of seat 1C. For safety compliance, I'll need to relocate you." Jalen blinked. "It's fine," he said. "I don't need to recline." "I'm afraid it's not optional. FAA regulations," she replied, already gesturing toward the back. No concern, no apology, just command. Jalen didn't argue. He stood slowly, briefcase heavier now than ever, and followed her through the quiet cabin. She led him past rows of padded leather, past champagne flutes and silk scarves, into the narrow aisle between economy and the lavatory. She pointed to seat 7C aisle seat, cramped across from the restroom. The smell of disinfectant and recirculated air hung heavy there. "We'll do our best to restore your seat after takeoff," she said, placing a cheap pair of plastic headphones on his new tray table. The Bose set he had been handed earlier? Gone. He didn't speak, just sat. His knees touched the seat in front of him. His briefcase barely fit underfoot. The cushion creaked beneath him, thinner and stiffer than anything up front. People walked past, some with puzzled glances, others with nothing at all. No one asked questions. No one offered empathy. The air grew warmer, staler. The seat screen in front of him blinked to life and greeted him, not by name but simply, "Welcome, guest." And for the first time in a very long time, Jalen Thorne felt entirely unseen. The hum of the engine was steady now, rising to that familiar altitude lull. The kind of white noise that usually made people relax, lean back, maybe even fall asleep. But in seat 7C, Jalen sat too stiffly for comfort. His back pressed against the upright seat back, his knees pushed against his briefcase. There was nothing relaxed about this flight so far. He watched the beverage cart inch its way through the rows, clinking softly with glass and metal. Up front, he could just barely hear the pop of wine corks and the quiet laughter of first-class passengers who'd never known what it was like to be questioned for simply existing in the right place. Jalen shifted slightly, trying to ease the strain in his lower back. The seat offered no give. He glanced down at the plastic-wrapped sandwich on his tray. Dry bread, 2 thin slices of turkey, and a few baby carrots sealed in a bag. No dressing, no option, no flavor. A far cry from the warm-plated meals he'd seen offered just a few rows ahead. He unwrapped it slowly, not out of hunger, but out of a need to do something with his hands. As he took a small bite, the cardboard texture of the bread confirmed what he already knew. He wasn't meant to feel like a guest here. A young flight attendant stopped at his row. She smiled, polite, distant, and glanced at her list. "Sorry, sir, this row isn't eligible for hot meal service," she said softly. "Airline policy for seats beyond row 5. He gave a small nod. "Understood." She placed a paper napkin beside him, then moved on. He didn't blame her. She hadn't written the policy. She was just following it, like Madison, like the gate agent, like the quiet passengers who looked but didn't speak. He reached for his phone, checked the time. Still hours to go before landing. The file needed to be signed, sent, delivered before the boardroom in Seattle filled up with people expecting results. He opened his laptop and tried again to connect to the in-flight Wi-Fi. Typed the code carefully, double-checking for typos. Access denied. Tried again. Same result. He pressed the call button. A few seconds later, Madison approached, her clipboard tucked tight against her side. "Yes? I'm having trouble accessing the Wi-Fi. The code provided with my ticket isn't working." Her smile was razor thin. "That code is reserved for our verified first-class passengers." "I was seated in 1C, he replied calmly. "I was reassigned." Her voice didn't change, but her tone carried something sharp beneath it. "Your current cabin class doesn't qualify for premium access," she said, motioning to the crowded row behind him. "I'm sure your team will understand any delay." Then she turned and walked away. Jalen stared at the blank login screen. The cursor blinked, steady and smug, like a reminder of what was slipping away 1 second at a time. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. He wanted to slam it shut, but instead he rested his palms on the cool metal surface and let out a long, steady breath. Across the aisle, a man in a blue checkered shirt gave him a quick nod, the kind that meant nothing but looked like it meant something. Jalen returned it, barely. He'd been here before, not in this exact seat, not on this exact flight, but in this space, the space between compliance and injustice, where everything looked fine from the outside, but inside you were being slowly unraveled. Behind him, the lavatory door opened with a low hiss. A wave of cold air and something chemical wafted over his row. He closed his eyes for a second. He didn't want to be angry. Anger didn't help on planes. Anger got you labeled. He pressed his palms into his thighs, grounding himself. A soft voice startled him. "Excuse me." He looked up. A young woman stood beside his row, slim, with dark curly hair pulled into a low bun. She wore a simple sweater and had earbuds tucked into her collar. "Are you Jalen Thorne?" she asked, quiet but clear. He blinked. "Yes." She smiled, and it wasn't condescending. It wasn't performative. It was genuine. "I thought I recognized you. I saw your keynote at the Equity and Investment Summit last year. You spoke about reshaping legacy access." He nodded once, carefully. "That was, a good night." "I'm Talia," she said, offering a hand. "I'm a graduate student at Columbia. I follow your work." Her presence was unexpected, like warm air in a cold room. He shook her hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Talia." She leaned in slightly, voice lowered. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw what happened. Back at the front. The reassignment. The way she spoke to you." He didn't respond right away. Then, "It's not the first time." Talia hesitated, then said, "It's still wrong." He nodded again, not in agreement, in understanding. She smiled once more, then returned to her seat quietly. He watched her go, a small shift forming in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Just then, Madison walked by again, heading toward the galley. She didn't glance his way, but her pace was just a little too brisk, and her grip on the clipboard just a little too tight. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude, but Jalen couldn't find stillness in his own body. His seat felt tighter by the minute, the edge of his briefcase digging into his shins. The vents above were blasting cold air directly onto his neck, and the faint antiseptic scent from the nearby lavatory had turned into a steady, unpleasant presence. He adjusted his posture again, gently moving the briefcase to his lap. As he leaned forward to unzip it and reach for a fresh copy of the contract inside, the aisle shifted with the approach of a beverage cart. Madison was back. She rolled the cart up the narrow aisle with one hand and balanced a tray of drinks with the other. Her expression was smooth, unreadable. She poured club soda into a glass for the row ahead, placed a can of ginger ale beside a businessman, and then reached for a small bottle of orange juice. Without a word, she turned slightly and placed the juice on Jalen's tray table, followed by a flimsy plastic cup. But then, without warning, her elbow nudged the edge of the tray. The juice bottle wobbled, tipped, and then it happened. Quick but unmistakable. A splash of cold orange liquid arched through the air and landed squarely across the keyboard of Jalen's open laptop. A sharp spark flickered. The screen blinked twice, then went black. Jalen inhaled through his nose, not sharply, not angrily, just trying to contain something that couldn't quite be named. Madison gasped, hand over her mouth. "Oh no," she said flatly. "That was an accident." She didn't move to help. No napkin, no gesture. She just stood there. Jalen reached for the laptop immediately, tilting it gently to let the liquid run off the surface. His sleeve pressed against the keys, trying to catch what he could. But the damage was done. The orange juice had seeped under the keyboard, sticky and final. He looked up. "Can I get some paper towels?" His voice was low, measured. Madison didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the galley. Moments later, a younger attendant, Jonah, appeared instead, holding a handful of napkins. "Here you go, sir," he said, handing them over with an apologetic nod. "Thanks," Jalen murmured. He dabbed at the machine. The keys were gummy, some refusing to bounce back. The screen stayed dark even after a long press on the power button. He exhaled again. This time there was a subtle quiver in it. The contract he was supposed to sign before landing? Still open, now lost. He looked around. The people nearby were either pretending not to see or watching too carefully. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows, shrugged, and turned back to his movie. Nothing had been loud. Nothing had been violent. But the humiliation was as real as a slap. He flagged Jonah again as the young man passed on his way back. "Do you have a replacement device? Even a tablet?" Jalen asked. "I just need to sign a document. 5 minutes." Jonah hesitated. "Let me check," he said, then disappeared behind the curtain. A few minutes passed. Jalen stared at the blank screen in front of him. Then Madison returned. No tablet, no offer, just her and that smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We can't provide premium devices outside of approved corporate passengers," she said, crossing her arms. "I was in 1C, he replied quietly. "You reassigned me." "Your current cabin status doesn't qualify," she said. "Policy's very clear." He looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, with something deeper, like fatigue wearing a mask of control. Behind her, Jonah stood frozen. He'd heard the exchange. He knew, but he said nothing. Jalen nodded once, slowly. "Of course," he said, barely above a whisper. She turned away. The scent of citrus still clung to his fingers. His sleeve was damp. The machine in front of him was useless. Across the aisle, someone whispered, "That's the guy who got moved, right?" A soft laugh followed. His name hadn't been called, but somehow everyone knew who the punchline was supposed to be. He closed the laptop carefully and set it aside. His hands rested flat on the tray table. For a long time, he didn't move. No one approached. No one asked. He thought about calling his assistant, but what could he say? "Sorry, the laptop drowned in orange juice." It almost sounded like a joke. Almost. The worst part wasn't the spill. It was the way it had been framed. Accidental, impersonal, and still undeniably targeted. It was a message. You don't belong here. And it had been delivered with a splash, a shrug, and just enough plausible deniability to go unquestioned. Jalen sat back slowly, his body tense, his dignity soaked into the creases of his suit. Outside the small oval window, the sky was calm. But inside that cabin, he was drowning in something no life vest could fix. The air in row 7 had grown heavier, as if the cabin itself had decided to press down on Jalen from all sides. The orange residue had dried into a sticky outline across the keyboard, and the napkins, now crumpled and useless, sat balled up at the edge of the tray. He hadn't touched the sandwich again. No appetite, just that dull tension sitting in his chest like a stone. 30 minutes passed, maybe more. Enough time for the quiet in the cabin to settle into something else, something watchful. Jalen could feel the change. Passengers weren't just avoiding eye contact anymore. They were glancing his way, quick and uncertain, like trying to make sense of something they didn't want to ask out loud. Then came the sound that made his gut tighten. Footsteps, not the light click of a flight attendant. These were heavier, deliberate, boots maybe, uniformed. Jalen looked up. A man approached, tall, stocky, wearing a navy blazer with the airline's security liaison badge pinned neatly to the chest. His jaw was square, his expression tight with professionalism, but his voice, when he finally spoke, carried just enough weight to command attention from surrounding rows. "Mr. Thorne?" Jalen sat up straighter. "Yes. I'm going to need to verify the contents of your electronic device," the man said, low and firm. "There was a report of a potentially unauthorized item in your possession." The words didn't land right. Jalen blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" "It's a routine precaution. Shouldn't take long," the man added quickly. "If you could just open your bag, sir." Around him, passengers turned in their seats, curiosity flickering into suspicion. Jalen's voice remained level. "My laptop's damaged. It's not working. I have a phone and a charger. That's it." "Understood. We'd still appreciate your cooperation." Jalen nodded. No choice, really. He unzipped the briefcase slowly and laid it open across his knees. Inside, the soaked laptop, a charger, a manila folder of documents, a single USB drive still clipped to the inner pocket. The officer picked up each item one by one, inspecting them without saying much. No metal detector, no scanner. Just eyes and hands and the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this before. "Could you power on the laptop?" the officer asked. "It's dead," Jalen replied. The man held it anyway, tilted it toward the light, pressed the button himself just in case. Nothing. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said, placing the laptop back gently. "We're all set." He gave a quick nod, then turned and walked back up the aisle. But it wasn't over, because as he left, Jalen saw Madison standing by the galley curtain, her arms crossed tight, watching, not curious, not concerned. Satisfied. That was when it hit him. She had filed the report. There hadn't been any suspicious behavior, no alert from another passenger. She'd planted the idea, quietly, efficiently, and now effectively. She hadn't just moved him. She was trying to mark him. He leaned back in his seat, heart thudding, not from fear but from the slow burn rage of understanding. This wasn't random. It was a campaign, built moment by moment, wrapped in policy, insulated by silence. He looked around. The man who had nodded at him earlier now sat with his arms crossed, angled away. A woman nearby had closed her eyes, clutching her handbag a little closer. They'd seen a man escorted and searched. That was all they needed. The truth didn't matter now. The narrative had been set. He was the one who got flagged. The man the crew had been watching. A little boy a few rows back whispered, "Is that him, Mom?" His mother hushed him quietly, but her eyes were already fixed on Jalen, narrow, wary. He turned toward the window, even though there wasn't much to see, just clouds and faint sunlight trying to cut through them. He tried to breathe through it, grounding himself with the sound of the engine hum. But it didn't help. The engine couldn't drown out what had just been confirmed. He wasn't just being inconvenienced anymore. He was being built into a story where he didn't write a single word, and everyone else was ready to believe it. The plane was still in the air, but Jalen felt like he was sinking. Not fast, not violently, just slowly, silently, like a weight tied to his name, dragging him under while everyone else sipped sparkling water and shifted their seatbacks with ease. His hands rested motionless on the tray table. The laptop ruined, the contract unsigned, the moment slipping. He'd stopped checking the time, not because he didn't care, but because it hurt more to watch the seconds run out while knowing he had done everything right and was still somehow behind. People were talking again. Not to him, never to him, but around him, over him, as if he were a detail in the wallpaper, something to work around, not someone whose world was unraveling in plain view. Across the aisle, a man pretended not to glance over, but Jalen could feel the weight of his gaze. Same for the couple, one row ahead, occasional peeks over their shoulders, followed by quick whispers. He wasn't paranoid. He was being watched. And not because he was dangerous, but because someone had said he might be. He leaned back as far as the cramped seat would allow, trying to stretch the muscles in his back. The seat wouldn't recline. The tray wouldn't fold properly anymore with the warped laptop on top. The entire space felt like a cage built out of inconveniences. The curtain to first class rustled. Then came the whispers. He couldn't hear the words exactly, but he caught enough. A clipped tone, a laugh, the word incident. Then his name, or rather a twisted version of it. Thorn or something, flagged before boarding. The voices faded into the clink of ice being dropped into glasses. He didn't move. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of reaction. Then came another sound, barely audible, but sharp, a soft digital click. Jonah, the younger attendant, had been walking past and paused briefly near the galley. His phone, screen dimmed quickly, disappeared into his pocket. Had he just... Jalen didn't turn around, but something tightened in his chest, and then a whisper from the seat behind him, barely veiled. Figures. It was followed by a chuckle. His body stayed still, but his heart was picking up speed. Not panic, but pressure. The kind that builds over time when you keep swallowing what no one else sees. He looked down at his pants leg, where a streak of orange had dried into a crusty stain near the seam. He brushed it absently, but it didn't go anywhere. It wasn't just juice anymore. It was proof of carelessness, of dismissal, of how easily dignity can be undone when it's no one else's priority to protect it. He tried to focus on breathing again, in through the nose, slow and steady. But even his breath felt like resistance now. A flight attendant passed with a tray of drinks. She handed out glasses to the rows ahead. When she reached his aisle, she paused, looked at her list, and gave a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, sir. This row isn't included in our premium beverage service." "Of course not." She placed a bottle of warm water on his tray and walked off before he could even respond. He looked at the label. It was the kind you find in waiting rooms and gas stations. This wasn't about drinks. It wasn't even about seats anymore. It was about erosion, quiet, strategic erosion. Each small thing had a reason. Each dismissal had a rule. Each delay had a policy. But taken together, they formed a wall, and he was on the wrong side of it. He glanced across the aisle again. The man in the checkered shirt was staring, not harshly, just curiously, like Jalen was some sort of puzzle that hadn't quite been solved. Their eyes met for a second. Then the man looked away, fast. Guilt. Jalen leaned back again, eyes on the seat in front of him. He didn't know what time it was anymore. He didn't know if the deal could still go through. But more than that, he didn't know how many more flights like this he could take. Not physically, mentally. The lights above dimmed slightly as the plane began its descent path. Somewhere near the front, a baby cried. Someone rang the call button. A bag shifted in an overhead bin. And Jalen sat in row 7C, hands folded, spine aching, silence pressing in. There was no policy against treating someone with humanity, but apparently there wasn't one requiring it either. And that's how they get you. Not with cruelty, with nothing. The descent had begun. Just a gentle shift in engine hum, that subtle press in the chest when the altitude started to drop. Most passengers hardly noticed. They adjusted their seats, refolded blankets, or picked up where they left off in their movies. But Jalen noticed everything. His body had grown stiff from hours of keeping still. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. Stillness as a shield. Stillness as strategy. He hadn't spoken since the spill. Not one word. Not a sigh. Not a complaint. Not a question. And still, he'd become the loudest presence on the plane. All without saying anything at all. From the far end of the aisle, Jonah walked back slowly, checking overhead compartments. His steps were slower than earlier, his eyes scanning rows, hesitating each time he glanced toward Jalen's section. He paused for just a second, then leaned down toward Jalen's row. "Would you like another water, sir?" he asked, quiet, almost cautious. Jalen looked up. "No, thank you." Jonah nodded once, but he didn't leave. He hesitated, and then, almost as if he was asking for permission, he whispered, "I didn't know." Before, who you were. Jalen didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question underneath wasn't about identity, it was about truth. Jonah reached into his pocket and slid something onto the tray table. A napkin folded, with handwriting on the inside. I know it's not much, he said, but someone should have said something. Before Jalen could speak, Jonah walked off again, quickly this time, head down. Jalen unfolded the napkin. Scrawled in pen, it read, Talia said you were the one who spoke at the Skyridge Equity Forum last year. I looked it up. I remember that speech. I'm sorry for what they did. You're not invisible, not to all of us. He stared at the words for a long time. His hands didn't move. His breath didn't change. But something inside him did. A crack. A shift. Talia. He turned slightly in his seat, glancing up the row. She was in 6A, earbuds in, eyes on her phone. But she must have felt it, because she looked up and met his gaze. Just for a second. And in that second, she gave him the smallest nod. Not dramatic, not performative, just real. Jonah hadn't written the note alone. She had started this. She had seen everything and refused to let it slide quietly by like the rest of them had. Jalen turned back to the tray table and folded the napkin again, tucking it carefully into the inside pocket of his briefcase. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was something. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the stiffness in his back. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin rustled again. Madison stepped through, clipboard in hand, mouth drawn in a line, eyes flicking from row to row like she was searching for confirmation of something. She didn't stop at his row, but she saw him, and he saw something different in her now. Not just control, uncertainty, like she could feel something slipping. A few minutes later, he caught sight of Jonah near the galley, whispering to Devin, the other flight attendant. Devin's expression changed as Jonah showed him something on his phone. A photo, a headline. Jalen couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the way Devin's brows rose. Recognition, then concern. They knew. Not because he told them, because they looked. And once you saw, you couldn't unsee. The balance in the cabin had shifted, subtly like air pressure adjusting before a storm. It hadn't erupted yet, but it was coming. And for the first time since he'd been pushed out of one sea, Jalen felt it. Not hope exactly, but something close enough to sit beside. The cabin lights dimmed again, this time signaling descent prep. Passengers began wrapping headphones, placing trays upright, gathering books and phones. It was the ordinary ritual before landing, but to Jalen, everything about it felt out of rhythm. He sat motionless. The folded napkin with Jonah's note was tucked safely inside his briefcase now, but its weight lingered in his chest. Words from a stranger who finally saw him. They shouldn't have meant so much, but they did, because until that moment, no one else had even tried. He leaned back, or at least as far as the stiff seat allowed, and stared at the seat back in front of him. There was a tiny chip in the plastic frame near the tray lock, barely noticeable, but he focused on it anyway. It was something real, something flawed, something there. From the galley, Jonah appeared again. This time he wasn't alone. Devin was with him, tablet in hand, a crease in his brow. Jalen didn't turn to face them, but he heard them whispering, not just to each other, this time to a third person. Talia, it was Devin who said it. If he's who you say he is, this is going to get very serious. Talia's response came without hesitation. Then maybe it's time someone took it seriously. She stood up from her seat and stepped into the aisle. Not dramatically, not to cause a scene. She simply moved with purpose. Jalen felt the shift before she said a word. She walked a few steps toward the front, then turned. Not toward Madison, not toward the crew, but to the rest of the cabin. "Excuse me," she said, calm and steady, her voice clear enough to cut through the hum of engines and last-minute announcements. Several passengers looked up. "My name is Talia James," she continued, "and I think everyone on this flight deserves to know something." The cabin grew still. You could feel the attention tilt, like gravity reorienting itself. "That man back there, in 7C, his name is Jalen Thorne. He's not just another passenger. He's the founder of Thorn Equity. He's one of the silent investors who helped keep this airline alive after the pandemic. Some of you probably saw him on the Skyridge equity panel last year. I know I did. A man in row 5 squinted at her. Wait, seriously? Talia nodded. Yes, and I saw what happened when he boarded. I saw how he was treated, how his seat was taken, how his name was erased. And no one said a word. Now the silence was different. Not the kind that ignored, the kind that listened. Jalen didn't move, but his hands folded in his lap tightened slightly. A woman in row 4 pulled out her phone, typing something quickly. Another passenger whispered, I thought I recognized him. Jonah looked toward Devon, who gave a slow nod, then turned toward Madison, still by the galley. Her posture shifted, just slightly. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the service tray. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Talia looked at Jalen now, directly, no fear in her eyes, just steadiness. I just thought you all should know, she said softly, because sometimes silence isn't neutral. It protects the wrong things. She returned to her seat. No applause, no cheering, just air that suddenly felt heavier with truth. Madison turned and disappeared behind the curtain without a word, but her absence said more than her voice ever could. Jalen closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to hold the moment. This wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was disruption. And sometimes that's where justice begins. Not with noise, but with someone finally choosing not to look away. The plane hadn't landed, but something had already shifted. The tension that had quietly coiled around row 7C was unraveling, not from any official announcement, not from apology, but from something more rare. Someone had spoken, not to defend him, but to say his name. Jalen stared out the window, his reflection barely visible against the clouds. The hum of the cabin had changed. It wasn't louder, but it was different. People were whispering now, but this time not in fear or judgment. This time, it sounded like questions. Did you know that was him? I swear I heard his name on NPR last month. Why would they move someone like that? The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane rustled. Madison stepped through. Her face had lost its usual poise. Her steps weren't as fluid as before. Something in her shoulders had stiffened. And for the first time since the flight began, she wasn't controlling the room. She passed Jalen's row without meeting his eyes. Devon followed, tablet in hand. He paused, lowered his voice beside Jonah. The manifest still shows him in 1C, he muttered. No service note. No malfunction flagged. Jonah frowned. So there wasn't a seat issue. Devon shook his head slowly. Not a real one, no. Jonah glanced toward Jalen and then at the other passengers watching now. Some curious, some suddenly embarrassed. Then the intercom clicked on. It wasn't the captain this time. It was Madison. Her voice came over the speakers, thinner than before, forced into that overly practiced calm. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for flying with Skyridge Air. We're preparing for descent shortly. As a courtesy, we'd like to recognize some of our loyal passengers on today's flight. Jalen knew what was coming, and yet the way it landed still caught him. A warm welcome back to Mr. Harold Benson, Platinum Elite, in seat 2A, a few polite claps from the front. And a special shout out to Mr. Jalen Rowe, seated in standard class, who was upgraded to our premium cabin today due to a seat reassignment. We hope you're enjoying your flight, Mr. Rowe. Rowe, not Thorn, not 1C, not investor, not founder, just a wrong name, a rebranded seat, a cheap lie whispered through polished teeth. The speakers clicked off. Jonah flinched. Even Devon looked away. Jalen didn't. He sat forward in his seat, arms resting lightly on the tray table, back straight despite the ache. He didn't react, but his silence now felt louder than before, like a held breath waiting to become thunder. A teenage boy seated 2 rows up turned to his mother. Mom, isn't that the guy who helped start that aviation program for black kids in Atlanta? His mother nodded slowly, guilt shadowing her expression. Yes, baby, I think it is. Talia turned in her seat, her eyes finding Jalen's. They're scrambling, she said under her breath. Jalen gave the faintest smile, but it wasn't one of satisfaction. It was the kind you wear when you know exactly what someone just tried to erase, and exactly how it backfired. Across the aisle, a woman in a cashmere wrap reached for her phone. She wasn't checking messages. She was searching, typing, Jalen Thorne, Skyridge keynote investor. A few seconds later, her eyes widened. She whispered something to the man beside her. He leaned over to look at her screen. They looked back toward Jalen, then toward Madison, then at each other. Recognition spread like static, quiet but impossible to contain. And somewhere beyond the curtain, behind the corporate polish and stainless steel of the front galley, Madison Greer must have felt it. The power she had borrowed from silence, it was slipping, because silence only holds when no one questions it. But now they were questioning, and for the first time all flight, she wasn't the one in control. The plane was beginning its final descent, but Jalen wasn't thinking about landing. He was thinking about legacy, not the kind you write in a will, the kind you carry into rooms that weren't designed for you, the kind you build word by word, only to watch it dismissed with a shrug and a mispronounced name. Roe. That's who he was now, according to Madison. A wrong name delivered in front of a captive audience. And yet, even as the sting of it lingered, something else was rising. It was subtle, but it was growing, an energy shifting row by row, like a ripple across still water. Passengers were talking, not loud, not disruptive, but with intention. Quiet voices, phones pulled out under tray tables, articles being shared, photos surfacing from past panels and interviews. Jalen Thorne wasn't just being remembered, he was being reintroduced. Devin stepped forward again, now holding his tablet like it was a shield and a confession at once. He stopped beside Madison near the galley and whispered something. Her posture stiffened. She turned away, pulled her tablet close, tapped the screen harder than necessary. Behind them, Jonah leaned toward Talia and murmured, "They know now. I think the whole cabin does." Talia's expression didn't change, but her hand curled slightly around her seat arm, like she was bracing for impact, not from turbulence, but from truth hitting the wrong people too fast. In the row behind Jalen, someone whispered, "He's on the Forbes Aviation Impact List. How did they not know?" Another voice, lower, older. "They knew, that's the problem." Madison returned to the aisle one final time before landing, walking quickly, her lips drawn into a thin line. When she passed Jalen, her eyes flicked toward him, but she didn't speak. Not a word. But the tension in her jaw, the tight grip on the back of a seat as she steadied herself, that was enough. Jonah appeared again. He stopped beside Jalen's row, cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Thorne, there's someone who'd like to speak with you once we land." Jalen looked up. "From Skyridge?" Jonah nodded quietly. "Yes, sir. From executive operations. They'll be waiting at the gate." Talia turned slightly in her seat, eyebrows raised. Jalen gave a subtle nod. He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. "They're not just apologizing," Jonah added, glancing nervously up the aisle. "There's an envelope. A formal one." Jalen looked down at his briefcase, the napkin note still tucked inside, his soaked laptop resting beneath it like a casualty. He didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth relaxed for the first time in hours. "You all right, sir?" Jonah asked, quieter now, almost unsure. "I'm fine," Jalen replied, and for once it wasn't just something he said to move on. It was close to the truth, because he'd been knocked down before, but this time the fall had been public, and the truth, it had followed. As the plane lowered through a bank of thin clouds, the skyline of Seattle came into view. The early evening light shimmered off the water, casting the cabin in soft golden gray. The landing gear deployed with a familiar rumble beneath the floor. And as the plane tilted gently for final approach, Jalen closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to steady himself. Because when that cabin door opened, he wouldn't be walking out as the man who had been moved. He'd be walking out as the man who couldn't be. Not erased, not renamed, not this time. And in row 7C, next to the lavatory with a broken laptop and 100 eyes on him, Jalen Thorne sat at the very center of a cabin that had finally learned his name. The wheels kissed the runway with a soft thud, followed by the low whir of reverse thrust. Around him, seatbelts clicked as passengers shifted in anticipation, bags rustled overhead, and the same robotic voice reminded everyone to remain seated until the aircraft came to a complete stop. But for Jalen, the landing didn't bring relief. It brought a kind of silence he recognized, a moment of calm right before things became real. He sat motionless as the plane slowed, gliding toward the gate. Outside the window, the Seattle skyline glowed beneath a curtain of soft clouds. The air on the tarmac shimmered, heat mixing with jet fuel and anticipation. In the front of the plane, Madison stood by the galley, her clipboard clutched tight to her chest. She wasn't making eye contact with anyone now, especially not with Jonah or Devin, who hovered nearby in awkward stillness. Devin tapped on his tablet, then glanced back toward the cabin, his lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Jonah caught Jalen's eye and gave a small, respectful nod. No words, just, acknowledgement. The plane rolled to a stop. That familiar ding sounded, the signal that things were about to move. But no one got up, because two figures had just stepped onto the jet bridge outside the cabin door. Jalen could see them through the narrow glass. A man in a dark navy blazer with the Sky Ridge crest stitched into the breast pocket, and a woman holding a sleek black tablet. They didn't look like ground staff. They looked like people who didn't speak unless it was officially on record. Madison saw them too. Her jaw tensed, shoulders squared as she tried to hold herself upright. But the color had drained from her face, and the confidence she'd carried for the entire flight had thinned into something brittle. The man entered first, scanning the cabin calmly. When his eyes found Jalen, he stepped forward without hesitation. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice professional but weighted with meaning. "I'm Daniel Reyes, Director of Corporate Compliance for Skyridge Airlines. We'd like a word." Behind him, the woman tapped something on her tablet and held out a sleek envelope embossed with the Skyridge emblem. Jalen stood. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He picked up his briefcase, wiped his palm against his slacks to clear the faint tackiness left from the dried juice, and stepped into the aisle. Passengers moved instinctively, creating space. Not because of fear, because now they knew. As he passed row 4, a woman gently placed a hand on his arm. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, apologetically, like she had finally realized what she'd missed. Jonah held the curtain open as Jalen moved toward the front. Daniel waited at the threshold of the plane. Before they exited, he turned to Madison. "Ms. Greer," he said flatly, "you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Please surrender your badge and credentials." The cabin gasped. A ripple of whispers followed. Madison stood frozen. "Are you serious?" Daniel didn't flinch. "This is a formal order, based on multiple passenger reports and internal findings." Her hand trembled as she unclipped her badge. The silver Skyridge pin on her chest, once worn like armor, was now a weight she couldn't wait to remove. She handed everything over. Her fingers were shaking. She looked at Jalen just once, and for the first time all flight, her expression cracked. Not anger, not smugness, but fear. She opened her mouth to say something, but stopped, because there was nothing left to say. Daniel gestured toward the jet bridge. "Mr. Thorne, we've arranged private ground transport and direct contact with executive leadership." The envelope passed into Jalen's hand. It was heavier than expected, not in weight, just in meaning. He nodded once and stepped off the plane, not out of it, above it, and behind him, the cabin exhaled, not in relief but in recognition. The airport terminal was unusually quiet as Jalen stepped off the jet bridge. No flashing cameras, no news crews, just polished tile floors, muted announcements over the PA, and the low hum of everyday travel continuing around him, oblivious to the small earthquake that had just happened on Flight 616. Daniel Reyes walked beside him with quiet purpose. The envelope still rested in Jalen's hand, unopened, but its presence felt intentional, like something that had been waiting for this moment far longer than just one flight. "I want to thank you," Daniel said as they passed a gate filled with boarding passengers, "not just for your patience, but for your restraint. There were opportunities to escalate. You didn't." Jalen kept his eyes forward. "Wasn't the first time I've had to choose silence over survival." Daniel didn't respond right away. Then, in a quieter voice, It shouldn't have come to that. They reached a private corridor near the executive terminal, where a black car was waiting outside the glass doors. A young assistant opened the rear door and stepped aside. Jalen paused. He looked down at the envelope again, then slowly peeled it open. Inside was a formal letter. Skyridge letterhead, CEO signature at the bottom. The words were clear, deliberate. Mr. Thorne, on behalf of Skyridge Airlines, I offer my deepest apologies for the treatment you endured aboard Flight 616. What happened was not an isolated inconvenience. It was a systemic failure, one we intend to correct, not only with words but action. Your dignity was compromised. That cannot be undone. But we hope to rebuild the trust that was broken today. Sincerely, Amani Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, Skyridge Airlines. Jalen folded the letter once and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't speak. Daniel added gently, "The board was notified mid-flight. There's already an internal review underway. You'll be contacted within the next 24 hours about joining our advisory panel on equity reform, if you're willing." Jalen gave a small nod. "We'll see." His tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't open either, because forgiveness didn't arrive just because someone asked. It arrived when the system changed. He stepped into the back seat of the waiting car, briefcase on his lap, the envelope beside him. As the door shut, he glanced out the tinted window and saw something that made him pause. At the far end of the terminal, standing alone near a security door, was Madison Greer. She wasn't in uniform anymore. She held a rolling carry-on in one hand and her phone in the other, but she wasn't scrolling. She was just standing, staring out at the tarmac like she didn't recognize the world beyond the glass anymore. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The confidence she'd carried like armor all flight was gone. She spotted the black car. Her eyes met Jalen's through the glass. No gesture, no apology, just a flicker of something between shame and disbelief. And maybe, somewhere in there, regret. But Jalen didn't hold the stare. He leaned back in the seat, rolled his neck slightly, and closed his eyes. Not to rest, to reclaim. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about the thousands of moments like this that never made it to the surface. The ones that didn't end with a letter, or a black car, or a name remembered. He thought about every time someone had been called out of line, told they were in the wrong seat, or made to feel invisible with a smile and a policy. He thought about the people who hadn't spoken up, and the few, like Talia and Jonah, who finally had. Outside the car window, the airport disappeared into a blur of concrete and sky. Inside, Jalen opened his phone. A message from Carla had just come in. Seattle investors moved the meeting to tomorrow. They said, "Ye take your time. We'll wait for the right man." He looked at the screen for a long time. Then slowly he typed, "Tell them I'll be there. Let's finish what we started." Because what happened on that flight, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about a system. And Jalen Thorne had just become the story they could no longer control or ignore. Not anymore. The next morning, Seattle greeted Jalen with gray skies and the familiar drizzle that never quite turned into rain. From the 38th floor of his hotel suite, he looked out at the skyline, coffee in one hand, the envelope from Skyridge still resting on the table behind him. He hadn't touched it since yesterday. Didn't need to. The real message wasn't in the CEO's signature. It was in the silence of the cabin when the truth had landed harder than the plane ever did. His phone buzzed. "Car's waiting. Investors already seated." Carla again, always 3 steps ahead. He grabbed his briefcase, slipped the letter inside without looking, and left the room. The boardroom on 3rd Avenue had a view of Elliott Bay and walls lined with polished wood and framed photographs of past corporate milestones. Around the table sat 8 people, investors, partners, 1 federal transportation consultant, and the head of Skyridge's strategic development team. They stood when he entered. He hated that part, but this time, something about it felt different, not performative, genuine. "Mr. Thorne," said a tall man in a navy sweater, "we're so glad you're here." Jalen nodded. "Let's begin." For the next 2 hours, he spoke, without anger, without raising his voice. He laid out his vision for equity-driven infrastructure, passenger protections, and accountability models that didn't just protect corporations, but passengers with names like his, in seats like 7C. Every face around the table listened, really listened. When he was done, no one clapped. No one rushed to interrupt. There was only a quiet pause before one woman finally said, "Why did it take something so public to get us here?" Jalen leaned back slightly. "Because people only look once the damage touches someone they recognize. Until then, they call it inconvenience." The man beside her exhaled slowly. "That ends now." Back at the airport, hours later, something else was happening. Skyridge's internal crew app, normally used for updates on flight schedules and rest breaks, had been buzzing since dawn. A screenshot had gone viral in the staff chat. It was a photo. Jalen standing beside the CEO, Amani Sterling, both of them shaking hands on a small stage after the closed-door summit. Behind them was a banner that read, "Passenger experience is human experience." Underneath it, Jalen Thorne joins as Strategic Equity Advisor, effective immediately. But the real photo, the one that spread faster, came from a different moment. Jonah had taken it discreetly, a snapshot from the gate the previous day. Jalen stepping into the black car, while Madison stood off to the side watching. Someone had captioned it. They tried to erase him. Now he's the one writing policy. Comments flooded in from flight attendants across the country. "That's the guy from 616? Respect. I worked with her once, knew something was off. About time someone at the top noticed. I don't care what anyone says, that's poetic justice." In a small break room at JFK, Madison sat alone, scrolling through her phone. She saw the photo. She saw the caption. She read every comment. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then fell to her lap. No reply. No defense. No one was listening now. Because silence, once her greatest weapon, had turned on her. And the story, it no longer belonged to her version. It belonged to the man in 7C, the one they all finally saw. Back in New York, 3 days later, a quiet buzz began circulating inside aviation circles, HR bulletins, and internal Slack threads. It started with a memo. Subject: Mandatory Ethics and Empathy Recertification. Effective immediately, Skyridge Airlines had never issued anything like it before. Not system-wide, not with this level of language. Following recent events, all customer-facing personnel must undergo an updated training program focused on unconscious bias, equitable passenger treatment, and real-time accountability reporting. It was signed by the CEO herself, and for those who hadn't been following what happened on Flight 616, the memo included a link, Case Study, Passenger Misclassification, the Thorne Report. It wasn't just an internal note, it was a line in the sand. Jalen sat alone on a bench just outside the Harlem co-working space where his firm had started 6 years earlier. No cameras, no stage, just the hum of passing cars and the late spring breeze weaving through his coat. He had just come from a meeting with a transportation subcommittee, this time not as a guest speaker, but as a formal consultant. The influence was growing, not because he chased it, but because people finally realized they had ignored the wrong man. He stared down at his phone, reading a message from Jonah that had come through earlier that morning. "Hey, I transferred to long-haul routes. Just wanted to say, thanks for staying calm. You changed more than you know." He smiled faintly. Another message popped up right after. "Also, Talia says hi. She's organizing a campus event. Wants you to speak if you're in town next month." He didn't respond right away. He let the messages sit, the way you let sunlight warm a bench before you take your seat. For so long, he'd taught himself to stay invisible in moments of discomfort, to fold into the background rather than draw attention. It was how he'd survived, but surviving was no longer enough. Now it was about showing up fully and letting others see the cost of pretending otherwise. Madison Greer sat in a meeting room in Queens, across from 2 investigators and 1 union rep. The review was almost over. She'd denied most of the allegations, blamed miscommunication, claimed the seat reassignment had been mechanical, that the spill had been an accident, that the Wi-Fi denial had come from a systems glitch. But none of that mattered now. The report from Devin and Jonah, combined with 3 anonymous passengers' statements, left little room for doubt. When she was finally asked if she had anything to say in closing, she sat still for a long time, then said, "I didn't think anyone would notice." And that was the last line in her file. Later that week, Skyridge held a small internal ceremony for its executive team and partner advisors. No media, no marketing, just acknowledgement. Jalen was presented with a token, nothing flashy, a replica of Seat 1C, cast in brushed silver, engraved with just 5 words. Presence is not permission, it's earned. As he held the miniature seat in his hand, the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd never wanted the recognition, but the flight had given him something else. Not just visibility, visibility on his own terms. He wasn't the man in seat 7C anymore. He was the man who turned 7C into a headline, into a policy, into a lesson they couldn't unlearn. And long after the plane had landed, the flight was still changing course, not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been told, "You don't belong here." Because now, because of one voice, one quiet refusal to disappear, they did. The sun was beginning to dip low over the Hudson, casting long golden streaks across the floor of the Skyridge Ethics Committee hearing room. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. The energy was heavy, not with drama, but with consequence. Madison Greer sat at the far end of the table, her posture no longer picture-perfect. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled, and her eyes, though still sharp, carried something new, the weight of being seen for who she really was, without the shield of a uniform or the comfort of denial. Across from her sat the panel, Skyridge's head of legal affairs, an external auditor, 2 union observers, and a woman from the Department of Transportation's Diversity and Equity Office. On the screen beside them, a slide was paused mid-sentence. Pattern of discretionary authority used to target specific passengers based on appearance without policy basis. The evidence was overwhelming now. 2 prior incidents had resurfaced during the investigation, both similar, both buried before. An elderly black couple reassigned mid-flight later told there had been a cabin error. A South Asian entrepreneur moved to the back after a tone complaint that no other passenger could corroborate. Neither had filed official complaints. But Jalen's story had opened the floodgates, and now they weren't just reviewing one bad day, they were reviewing a pattern. Madison's hands were folded tightly in her lap. She spoke when asked, but her answers were clipped, increasingly defensive. At one point, she tried to pivot the conversation, mentioning stress, staffing shortages, misinterpretation of tone. But the panel wasn't buying it, because silence can only carry a lie so far. And this time, the silence had turned on her. The lead panelist, a woman in her 60s with steel gray curls and decades of union oversight behind her, finally closed her folder. "Ms. Greer," she said, calm but firm, "your actions represent a breach not just of protocol, but of principle. You didn't just fail a passenger. You failed a promise this company made to treat every person with dignity." Madison didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, tightly, as if even she had finally accepted what was coming. Later that day, a formal company-wide memo was released. Effective immediately, Madison Greer has been terminated from all roles within Skyridge Airlines. Her conduct violated both internal policy and external regulatory standards. Additionally, Skyridge has filed a professional conduct notice with the FAA to prevent future rehiring under falsified application. It was the kind of statement most companies bury in HR archives. But this one, it was sent to every employee, because this wasn't about one flight anymore. It was about a shift in culture, and no one would forget where it began. That same afternoon, Jalen walked the familiar halls of Thorn Equity's downtown office. He paused by the wall in the main lobby, where his company had started placing photos of their outreach initiatives, young aviation interns at Newark, a STEM partnership with a community college in Detroit, and now, newly framed, an image of Talia speaking at Columbia University's Equity and Innovation Symposium. She'd started the conversation on that plane. Now she was leading it in classrooms. Jalen stood in front of the wall for a moment, taking it in. Not with pride, with purpose. The reckoning had come. Not with fanfare, not with press conferences, but with clarity. Everyone involved had been held accountable, openly, transparently. And as the final pieces settled, something else was becoming clear. This wasn't just a correction. It was the beginning of something better. Weeks later, the world had moved on. News cycles spun into new stories. Headlines shifted toward elections, climate updates, and tech launches. But inside airports, on flights, and across boardrooms, something had changed. Not loudly, but undeniably. At JFK Terminal C, tucked near Gate 12, a new plaque had been installed. It wasn't big, no ribbon cutting, no press invite, just brass on wood with a short inscription, in honor of the quiet moments where dignity is defended. Seat 7C, Flight 616, never forgotten. Travelers passed it without always noticing, but some stopped, read, reflected, because word had spread, not just of the incident, but the response. It had become a case study at airline conferences, in HR departments, and in university ethics classes. The Thorn case, not just about injustice, but about restraint, about what happens when someone doesn't react the way they're expected to, and changes everything by doing so. In his office overlooking Lower Manhattan, Jalen Thorne stood by the window, watching ferries move across the water like slow punctuation marks against the city's rhythm. He wasn't thinking about the flight, not directly. He was thinking about the ripple. Talia's internship program had already tripled in applicants. Jonah had been promoted to lead crew trainer. His first module focused on empathy over ego. And Madison? She disappeared from the industry entirely. No statement, no appeal. The silence she once weaponized had now turned inward. But Jalen never asked for retribution. He'd told Carla that from the start. Justice isn't about making them pay, he'd said. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. Later that evening, Jalen was invited to speak at a closed summit hosted by the Department of Transportation. The panel topic was printed in bold on the conference guide: When Policies Fail, the Role of Individual Conscience in Corporate Culture. He stepped onto the stage, no notes, no pre-written script, just a mic, a stool, and a room full of decision makers. He looked out at them for a long, quiet second before he began. "I didn't raise my voice," he said evenly. "I didn't demand special treatment. I asked for the seat I paid for, and was told I didn't qualify to sit where I already belonged." The room held still. And that's the thing about dignity. It's not a perk. It's not a privilege. It's the baseline. And when we treat it like an upgrade, we fail everyone. He let that settle, then continued. "I didn't change the system by fighting. I changed it by refusing to be erased." A pause. I sat still, but the world moved. That night, back in his apartment, Jalen made himself tea, just chamomile and honey, and sat on his balcony as the lights of the city flickered below. His phone buzzed once. A message from Talia. "Tonight, a professor used your story in class." One of the students cried, not out of sadness, but because, she said, finally someone didn't yell. He just stood. Jalen stared at the message, the city humming behind him like a lullaby. And for the first time since Seat 1C was taken from him, he allowed himself to feel what had been stolen and what had been returned. Not just respect, but recognition. Because stories don't end when the plane lands. They echo. And this one, it would keep echoing. Through classrooms, through cabins, through every seat where someone once felt unseen. In the end, Jalen Thorne didn't need to raise his voice, because the truth spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. This story isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about how quiet bias becomes policy, and how quiet courage can undo it. So let us ask you, have you ever seen dignity tested in silence? What would you have done if you were sitting in row 6 or 8? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, taught you something, or simply made you think, hit that subscribe button and follow us for more stories that bring justice to light, one seat at a time.